The second period of a hockey game creates certain challenges. Bethany Brausen is going to talk about the long shift effect. Bethany, you have your two sisters here with you as well. Are they going to be up on stage and having to communicate as well, or are you going to do this by yourself?
They don't know this, but yes, they're coming. No, they're not actually coming up here, but they would be so mad at me if they did. But yes, they are joining me from Little Canada is where we're from. That's a real city name in Minnesota.
Really?
Yeah, I know. Everyone's always kind of just flabbergasted by the fact that that's even a city name, but Little Canada.
Maybe Donald Trump could take that area.
Yeah, he probably would try to, for sure. Yep.
The long change effect. Bethany Brausen, you're the head coach of University of St. Thomas in Minnesota.
Yes.
You've been a player yourself. You've been an assistant coach. Stage is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, so speaking of my sisters, they did join me. The first day we got here was Thursday. And I was going to practice my presentation for them, kind of go through my slide deck. And they fell asleep both probably 10 to 15 different times. I was like, Samantha, sit up, Bree, like eyes open. And so it wasn't super reassuring, I feel like, for this group that they fell asleep so much, but I'm going to blame that on the jet lag. And hopefully this is a topic that in a room full of hockey people is kind of interesting, or maybe a different way of looking at a topic within the sport that we've always kind of heard about, maybe have been aware of, but probably have not paid as much attention to as maybe we should. So today, like I said, we're going to be talking a little bit about the impactful effect of the long change effect in hockey. So a quick introduction about me. As mentioned, my name is Bethany Brausen. I am now the head coach at the University of St. Thomas in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. That's in the United States. We were in our fourth year in the transition to Division I, and this fall coming up, we'll be in that fifth year as a kind of a new exploratory program. Previous to that, I actually was a player as well. I played at the University of Minnesota from 2010 to 2014 before I started coaching there a couple of years later. So kind of an interesting, setup, because I was actually my first year coaching, I was coaching freshmen from when I was a player. So it was a really interesting dynamic, kind of a fun segue into coaching, but actually got to coach some of my teammates. And I always kind of thought I'd be in hockey for a couple of years. And then here I am over 10 years later, still in college athletics. So after I was a player, like I said, I started playing in 2010 to 14, and then 2 years later started coaching. I was at the University of Minnesota as an assistant coach for 5 years before going over the river. Is about 10-15 minute drive over to St. Thomas campus. And like I said, really dichotomous experiences, going from one of the most kind of like traditioned, rich hockey programs in women's hockey and men's as well, to a brand new startup program in its first year. So it's been a fun experience, and happy to kind of talk with more people about that and some different moments throughout the weekend. I do want to say thank you to everyone for being here. I know everyone's time is really precious and valuable, especially in the coaching world. There's a lot of demands on our time. And so the fact that we all are able to gather here today, and like was said at the beginning of the conference here, just really share some information and knowledge with like-minded people, I think is a really special opportunity, and one that I feel extremely grateful for, to be standing up on stage and hopefully give you guys, like I said, a little different perspective or look on some topics that maybe we know about, we're aware of, but not paying attention to in the way that we should. So to start this presentation, I want to ask a question, and I'm going to front end this by saying I completely understand this is a big ask and probably an impossible question to answer. But the question is this: if you could only pick one period of the hockey game that you want your program to play their best hockey, and you can only choose one, and it would give you the best chance to win, I'm curious, by a show of hands in this room, what people would say. So obviously, as ice hockey coaches, everyone's very aware. Our choices here would be the first period, the second period, and the third period. So I'm going to give you guys just 1-2 seconds. Again, go with your gut. I know it's an impossible question, but just by nature, walking in today, what would you have said for however many years you've been coaching? So let's see a show of hands for the first period. Who thinks starting well, coming out, maybe getting a good lead? Okay, so a few people. What about the second period? Okay, so a few people too, probably maybe 10 to 20% of the room, I'd say. Well, about third period, finishing well, yep, maybe closing a gap, extending a lead. That was the majority of the room. I know this is on video, so just want to make that known. Majority of the room, I would say, was leaning towards that third period. Why this is interesting is I actually did the same thing. So about a couple months ago, when I knew I was going to give this presentation and landed on the long change effect as a topic, I asked that exact same question. I polled about 20, 25 coaches that are just kind of in my network. I asked the same exact question I just asked you guys, and pretty similar results. But as you can see, a lot of people said the third period. Right? So they thought finishing well, finding a way to either regain and try to get a lead or sustain a lead was really, really important. Okay, so most people said that. And then between the first and the third period, we actually had 80% total said it had to be one of those. So what was a really interesting thing when I asked this is people didn't only say, oh, it would be the third period, for example, or oh, it would be the first period. What was really interesting is more than half the people I asked, unprompted, said, well, if it wasn't one, it would be the other. It's, you know, that kind of cheat answer where they say, yeah, I would say the first period, but the third period is really important too, and this is why. Or I would say the third period, but if it wasn't the third period, it'd have to be the first period. So really interesting that not only the majority said the first and last period of the game, but the majority also followed up and said if it's not one or it's the other. So only 20% of the whole coaches group that I asked, and similar to this room, not that many in here as well, advocated for the importance of the second period. So what we're going to talk a little bit about today is the significance of the second period of a hockey game. And I thought this was really interesting the more I dug into it. This was kind of a passion project of mine this year by stumbling on an article that I'll kind of break down and talk more specifically about. But really, really interesting. The second period has a ton of significance in the hockey game. And statistically speaking, the second period is actually the most impactful period of a 60-minute hockey game. Most people don't necessarily know this or don't necessarily think this. And so why would this be the case? And the biggest reason for the significance of the second period is actually the long change effect. And so I know that we have a lot of different coaches from a lot of different areas, so I just kind of want to go through a little bit of terminology. I know we all use different language around things, but when we talk about the long change effect, what is that exactly? So in the first and third period, as we all know, we get the convenience of that shorter change. So in most rinks, I know not all of them, but the mass majority, I would say, is a traditional rink is set up with those players' benches that are actually side by side rather than having kind of being in that opposition where they're directly across from each other. So again, in most traditional rinks, in that first and third period, we get the convenience of that really short change in ice hockey. So that way, when you're getting hemmed in the zone, we've all been there before, all of a sudden it's back-to-back shifts, we're getting really tired. We can still look to get line changes, in particular with our defensemen, in a much more convenient fashion, and players can kind of change out freely. Now, in the second period, as we all know, traditionally in ice hockey, we go to the long change effect, which just means that in the second period, we switch ends of the ice with our goaltenders, causing our D zone to be on the opposite side as our player benches. And as we all know, that leads to a lot of challenges with fatigue of players, getting hemmed in your zone, and it's much tougher to change conveniently, hence the long change effect. So I want to give a little bit more context, not only of like what the long change effect is, but a little bit of history too, because this was stuff I didn't know. And so I thought a good majority of the room might not know this either. So when we talk about the long change effect, we start thinking about it. Why does it even exist in the first place? And as you guys hear me talk about this and the modernization of the game, it might even challenge your thinking a little bit of, does it make sense to actually switch ends? But I'll leave that to you guys to kind of sort out as we go through. But why does it exist? So when organized hockey first started, traditionally it was played outdoors. Makes sense, it's a winter sport, and so that's where it all started. And what would happen is that teams, to account for weather conditions in particular, they would switch ends of the ice after the first period. But as I put a caveat on here, what's kind of interesting is it wasn't necessarily periods when the game first started. It was traditionally played in 2 halves. And so that really accounted for an equitable game because teams would play in one end in the first period or the first half of the game. And then when they switched, each team got to play half of the game in completely equal winter weather conditions. Another caveat of this is that when they did actually move to 3 periods when they were playing outdoors, they would actually pause the third period about halfway through and they would switch ends once again. So even though they moved to kind of that more traditional 3-period model, they were still accounting for those weather conditions in the third period so that each team played a total of 30 minutes with equal weather conditions. So again, kind of just a little bit of interesting background as to why that started in the first place. But like I said, the game has modernized quite a bit. I'd argue a lot of this has to do with kind of the commercialization of sports as well. And so the game officially moved indoors, and there were 2 men I want to point out. Their names were Lester and Frank Patrick, and their kind of big claim to fame in 1910 to 1911, when the game really traditionally started to move indoors, is that they proposed a formal change to be 3 periods of ice hockey, which is where it stands today. So now we have that 3-period model, about 20 minutes, obviously for every period here, rather than that 2-minute or 2 30-minute segments that they were playing before. But I would think, as I kind of digged into the research and tried to figure out why this was the case, that it sustained this model. Like I said, a lot of it comes back to commercialization nowadays. So they kind of held that model, but for different reasons, right? So you got fan experience. Now you're seeing action on both sides of the ice more often. The obvious, food, beverage, and merchandise sales obviously greatly increase when there's 2 intermissions rather than just 1. So there's an advantage there. And then obviously the game has really changed quite a bit from when we first started playing outdoors to moving it inside to the professional game that it is now. And so things like more rest and better ice conditions for these elite athletes is really important. So that's why the model kind of stands today and why we continue to play 3 periods of hockey. So a quick visual representation. Again, I know I'm in a completely different country, so maybe when I say rinks are standard one way or another, I might be speaking just from my own experience. But again, this is that traditional setup that I described. So benches kind of typically on that same side of the ice next to one another. And you can see why in the first and third period, you get that convenience of that shorter change. And then obviously, as you go into the second period, we get that long change coming from the opposing side of the ice. Okay, so again, now that we got a little bit of history, a little bit of background context as to what the long change effect is, where it came from, why it stands today, I do want to point out, I think that there's typically kind of 3 camps, I'll call them, of coaches. And I would say the first camp of coaches, I think that everyone, it's fair to say in this room, could agree that we're all aware that the long change effect exists in ice hockey, but outside of that, there might not be a lot of investment beyond that. We know it exists and we kind of just play the game, maybe mention it occasionally. The second group is aware it exists, but they might do a little bit more with it. They might be aware of it. They might build it in a little bit more. They talk about it with their teams occasionally. And I'm just even thinking how many coaches I had over the years. You go the second period and you get that traditional line, something to the effect of make sure we got short changes, second period. So kind of think of it that way. Camp 2 of coaches. And camp 3 of coaches would be not only aware that the long change effect actually exists, but I would say that they invest a substantial amount of time and a lot of intentional effort into how they build their game systems and their structure around it to leverage this time of the game in particular. And my goal of today is not only in this room, but to anyone that would listen to this, would be to recruit as many coaches as possible to the third camp. And I probably should have reordered these and actually called it the second camp just to be in line with the themes of today. But that would be the ultimate goal. So why should you guys care? As coaches in this room, people that are part of different hockey organizations, why should you value this topic? So I mentioned an article that I started to kind of pay more attention to this year. And we started to really talk about it with our group at St. Thomas and start to build in some drill ideas and game structure around this. Because I think you should care. And this is why. There was a man by the name of Blaze Grubik, and in 2023 to 2024, that NHL hockey season, he actually wrote this really interesting article. You guys can Google it, and it'll be one of the only things that comes up because there's not really a lot of conversation around the long change effect in hockey and how important it is. So if you Google this, it'll be the first thing that you find, and it's a really interesting article. I'm going to try to do it justice here, but I definitely encourage you guys to go in and kind of deep dive into it if you're interested in this topic. But the biggest kind of takeaway or finding for Blaze as he looked at this a little bit more closely is that he wanted to do an assessment of how many goals were scored in the NHL throughout that whole season. So in 2023 to 2024, what were the total amount of goals that were scored broken down by each period? So this is what he found. In the first period, there were 2,349 goals that were scored. In the second period, 2,752. And in the third period, 2,759. And if I was a part of that 50% or so in here that raised their hand when they said the third period is so important, I'm probably feeling pretty good right now because I'm looking at that and you're like, see, Bethany, there's evidence right there. But again, as a room full of coaches, I think we can all understand and appreciate that there's a very unique factor of the third period. And that unique factor is the fact that there is an opportunity for a lot of empty net goals to be scored when we pull a goalie to try to close that lead at the end of a game. So when that's accounted for, interestingly enough, obviously period one goals stay at 2,349, nothing changes there. Second period goals remain 2,752. But oddly enough, coincidentally, the period three goals, when you account for empty net goals that were scored, is 2,349, which now matches and mirrors the first period. So it drops significantly. And for those of you that like research, that is a statistically significant difference by quite a bit. So if you look at this chart here, you can see this first chart on the left as you look up. That's that original chart. So when we don't account for the empty net goals, that's what it looks like. The chart right next to it is when we do account for those empty net goals, you can see really that skyrocket in the second period of all the goals that get scored. And so when we kind of look a little bit more closely and employing all this again from the article, I want to make sure I'm giving credit where credit is due. When we look at these goals in particular, he also asked, well, how are these goals scored? Is there some unique way? What does that look like? And interestingly, it doesn't matter. The goals did not discriminate. They were scored more goals on wrist shots, snapshots, slap shots, tips, backhands, miscellaneous, you name it and you think of it, and more goals were scored in that manner in the second period. If you're curious about the overall shots in the second period, those increased significantly as well. And so that year, in that 23 to 24 ice hockey season, there were 32 teams in the NHL, all of which, besides two, so 30 of the 32 teams scored the most goals in the second period compared to the first and third. So this is definitely not a unique situation. This was very commonplace for all the teams throughout the NHL. Again, with the exception of two teams, almost 95% of NHL organizations, this was reflective for. So again, very interesting as we look at it a little bit more deeply too. It's not just the goals either. I mentioned shots, but let's really break it down. When we think about the second period, obviously our shift length increases, right? Because a lot of times we get hemmed in the D zone, and naturally that's going to increase shift length for a lot of programs. Zone exits start to drop because fatigue is setting in. All of a sudden we can't get those zone exit opportunities, or maybe not be as fresh. So those drop, as well as line changes. As it goes hand in hand with shift length, line changes also decrease in the second period. And like I said, the most important factor here to consider is that level of fatigue for our hockey players. That jumps up quite a bit. I already mentioned the shots, and assists I thought were also very interesting. So assists increase significantly in the second period. A kind of nuance as well is that it wasn't just one assist type of goals, but it was also two assist type of goals. And for those of you that are more closely tied to the NHL, this in particular is really interesting too. Because if you know about this in the NHL, the mass majority of goals are actually scored as 2 assist type of goals. So these are in particular really important goals in how they are scored, right? So it's not just one, but it's finding the opportunity to keep possession, maintain zone time, find players not once but twice, and over 70% of NHL goals are scored in this manner. So really important. And then of course, everyone's favorite topic to talk about, I see Jess Campbell in the stands over here, and she's going to be talking about this later in the symposium, but penalties increase. Overall, over 20% more penalties happen in the second period. This is true really across different platforms. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But it's true in all 3 zones too. So it's not just in our defensive zone when we get tired that those penalties increase, but it's true in the neutral zone as well as the offensive zone. Power plays then increase, and as we all know in this room, when power plays increase, those goals go up. And so I was trying to figure out, was this just a one-off unique situation by chance that in 2023 to 2024 that this was the case? That'd be just kind of a convenient study. So I wanted to look at a little bit of a different sample pool to pull from. So I did my own research, and what I wanted to look at was the NCAA national tournament for men's hockey this year. I thought that would be a really relevant group for a lot of people, very curious about that group. And I think that there's a couple things that make this really an interesting and unique sample to pull from. Number one, in theory, these teams should be the most conditioned they've been all year, right? They've had a lot of time to practice. They should be the most conditioned. But at the same time, because that's the longest season in all of college athletics is hockey, actually. In theory, they should also be the most fatigued when they get tired. So again, really interesting things to kind of measure here. And also, they have the highest level of compete and desperation in these games because they're playing for that national tournament, right? So again, you'll see something that's going to look a little bit similar, but in the first period, there were 21 goals that were scored. In the second period, there were 26 goals that were scored. And in the third period, there was actually 34 goals that were scored. But again, this would be a spoiler alert. You guys already kind of know the nuanced background of this, but we know that there's a couple things to account for. And what's really interesting about the national tournament this year is there were also a lot of overtimes. I would say characteristically more than one would expect. And so why that matters is because when we think of going to overtime in men's hockey, you do switch ends of the ice. That's part of the rules. And so when we do account for not only the empty net goals that happen in the third period, but then we also look at the long change effect that is now happening in those overtime games, those goals change once again. So the first period remains the same at 21. Period 2, the goals increase to 31. And then in period 3, it drops to 29. So the second period wins out as the most important from a goal scoring perspective once again. So again, with the long change effect, and we're looking now at the NCAA in the national tournament here, there were 2 teams that actually had the most second period goals throughout the tournament. Is anyone willing to take a guess of one of the 2 teams that maybe that was true for? Western Michigan was one of them. Any other thoughts? Boston, good guesses, because Boston University and Western Michigan did indeed have the most goals. If you guys followed the tournament, you will also know that those are the 2 teams that actually made it to the national championship. And then there was a team as well that had the least amount of goals that were scored against them in the second period. Any guesses as to what team that was? That is correct. It was your national champion. Western Michigan had the least amount of goals scored against them in the second period. So again, that was kind of evidence that I stumbled into just looking at the goals first. And I was like, wait a minute. And as I dug a little bit deeper, just a little further evidence of the importance of the second period. So my hope is that there's a few people, at least in this room, that are a little bit more convinced of the importance of the second period at this point. But I think it's really important not only to talk about the fact that, again, bring awareness to it, talk about it, start thinking about it, but actually find some application. Like, how does this show up? How can we have it impact our programs? And so what do you do about it? I put on here, I think this is a really important disclaimer to start with, is that, and I thought our first presenters did a great job of this as well, is that these are ideas. They're not necessarily universal truths. But the point of going through some of these components, these applications and takeaways is so that you can start to think about maybe this works with our group, what she's describing. Or maybe if we just tweaked it slightly or kind of took this approach, but really to kind of open up our understanding not only of the importance of the second period, but how we can apply within our own groups. So again, I'll give you guys some ideas, but again, it's meant to be more descriptive and get us thinking about things and how it looks within your own programs, because everyone has different strengths, different weaknesses, and we can leverage them accordingly. But it is certainly not prescriptive. I don't want people to walk away, take notes, and be like, okay, if I do X, Y, and Z, that's going to be the key to our success. It could be a part of the key to success, but really doing some digging on your end and with your staffs about what this looks like for your group is going to be really important. So to me, when I think about kind of major takeaways or what are these components and applications, how do we actually implement this into our programs, I see two kind of major buckets to be thinking about. I would say the first one is that mental and psychological component of the second period, right? That's going to be really important to address. The second, I would say, is the physical component. So how does the physicality, how can we kind of push and make sure that we are challenging ourselves to think differently from the physical perspective as well? So when we talk about the mental and psychological component, I break it down into three major areas. The first is task engagement and flow states. The second is team identity. And the third, which I think we have the biggest hand in, is coaching decisions and bench management in the second period. And I'm going to touch on all three with really kind of putting an emphasis on that third point. So like I said, the first one, I think comes back to kind of that psychological idea of engagement and focus in a task. We've heard a lot of research and evidence-based. I'm a strong advocate of that as well, just kind of in my personal background. I will say this is anecdotal, what I'm going to share with you, but I do think there is a degree to which, in a hockey game, at least in my experience, oftentimes teams come out and in the first period, they're just really focused, really dialed in. They have a lot of energy around the game that's very natural. In the second period, sometimes it can kind of feel like this in-between, right? Where it can get a little monotonous. We're trying to make changes and adjustments, but it's really kind of that big window right in between. But in the third period, I think our natural energy kind of picks up again as a program and as a former player. I think there's something that happens, similar to why you all raised your hands, that we just redial back in and we kind of refocus on the task at hand. So again, this is anecdotal to start, but I do think there's a really unique window of the second period where we don't have that natural energy shift up, and we are accountable to that. So I think it's also interesting because if you guys have ever heard of this concept, I would write it down. I would not write the author's name down because good luck spelling that. But you can look this up. So flow is actually a psychological construct. It's talked about really readily in sports psychology in particular. But this state of flow is what happens when our skill set, so we have a really high skill set, and that matches the challenge of the experience that we are in, right? And so if I have the skill set, if practice, like we've talked about, has prepared me well, and my skill set can meet the challenge of the environment I'm in, we can reach this state that's called flow. That's the upper right part of this chart. And when we do, has anyone ever heard of like a runner's high? So most people kind of can parallel this with a runner's high. So when you are just fully invested, time is kind of flowing. There's just really not a lot of thinking going on. It's just like everything is going your way. And athletes typically describe this as being in the zone. So the second period, just from a kind of a research-based practice, it's actually the easiest time to get into flow for an athlete because it takes some time to get into it. It takes time to come out of it as well. But the second period offers this really unique crossroad where we can say, okay, it can either be the middle of the game and we can kind of get monotonous and not be thinking about it, or we can be very aware that this is actually the peak level of performance opportunity for our athletes is in that 20 minutes. And so if we can really capture that window in the middle of the game, we're going to be in a really, really good spot. And so a lot of coaches would say, well, I'm not an expert, I'm not a sports psychologist. How does this look? How can I be helpful and help players kind of get into this engaged state of flow? And there's 4 ways you can do it. Number one is fostering a positive environment. That's probably not earth-shattering or anything crazy for you guys in the room, but when we foster a positive environment, similar to some of the previous presentations, we might even be allowing for more mistakes, right? And we're giving opportunities for our players to play more freely. But that positive environment is really important to create these flow states. Also, clear expectations for our players. We do need some direction. It can't be just completely throw anything at the wall. We have to make sure that they understand what the expectations are so that they feel confident and convicted in that. The third one, I'll talk a little bit more about this, is developing the skills and mastery so that, like I said, that skill set can match the challenge that they're in with those really intense hockey games. And then the fourth one is providing focus and proper mindset. And so I think as coaches, we actually have a pretty good hand in helping create that focus and that proper mindset. And that'll lead me into my next point. So to me, when we talk about focus, mindset, how are we approaching that as a coach? The second one I wanted to talk about was team identity. I believe that it's very rare to meet a coach or an athlete who would tell you, gosh, we are a second period team. Like first and third, we're okay. It's not really a focus area, but man, do we dial into the second. I've never met a player that said that. I've met players all the time that they're like, we are a first period team. We come out, we take a lead early, we're fast, we get on them. I've heard a ton of athletes and coaches say the same thing about the third period. We always find a way to win. We dial it in the last 20. We keep it close. But I don't know if I've ever heard someone say, we are a second period team and completely take pride and identity around that. Now, what if your group did? It's an interesting thought, because if your group did compared to the other teams that you're playing and you said, we are going to be better in the space of the second period than any opponent we play, and you did that consistently, game to game to game throughout a whole entire season, and you won the second period of the whole season because that was a part of your team identity and who you were. Think about the advantage and the leverage that creates against your opponents, because I'm willing to bet that the team and the coaches on the other side of the rink are probably not doing that. So similar to Western Michigan, learn from them and say, can we create identity around this? Can we be a second period team and know that in the long run it's going to pay off? And so the questions I would challenge you to think about with this, when you think about team identity, is what does that look like for you guys? What does it look like? What does it sound like? How do you celebrate small things? What is the practice environments, right? So what does that team identity look like for your group? The third one, like I said, I think that we can be most pivotal in helping change is coaching decisions, and in particular around bench management. And so up here as kind of the general rule of thumb for the second period, what I would encourage is error on the side of line changes. So I know I and probably every person in this room at some point was kind of on the fence of making a line change. And you're like, oh, I think they're kind of fresh. Maybe I keep them out. Can they hold off? Do we take a timeout? Get a line change? What do we do here? And I've been on both sides of it. You know, the side where you're like, I should have changed the lines. Like we just got scored on, that's on me as a coach. That was my fault. I've also been on the other side where we got lucky and I just took a deep breath and I was like, okay, we somehow got through that storm. But geez, I probably should have changed, right? And I see some heads nodding and smiles like we've all been there before. And so err on the side of line changes, in particular in the second period, because we know that there's a lot of things that are going to be influenced and kind of show up in the second period that they won't in the same way in the first and the third. And when I think of bench management as well, I want to kind of categorize this as two different groups. So you have your top group, not to offend anyone if there's hockey players in the room, but there's always kind of a top group. And let's think of it as your top group and then kind of your third and your fourth group, all of which are very, very important as we know. And so when we think of the top group in the second period, I think it's really, really strategic and intelligent to utilize them in specific moments as much as possible. So with those top groups, I think anytime that you have, just especially as a home team, but we all know the opportunity for a lopsided matchup. This is true throughout the whole game, but in particular in the second, when you get the opportunity for a lopsided matchup, I'm thinking in particular on no change situations. So for us at the college level, icings. That's when you want to really leverage those top groups, make sure you get them out there. And if you can, in a perfect world, you go back to back with your first and your second, because that can really give you an advantage. Again, hem a team in the D zone, and you can take advantage of that situation. You also want to keep in mind, you want to keep them fresh for special teams. So if power plays are going to go up, penalty kills are going to go up in the second period, as much as possible, you want those top groups to be as fresh as possible because you know you're going to have to utilize them the most. Now that obviously segues into your third and fourth group. In my opinion, based on everything that I read, the time on ice should be the absolute highest for your third and fourth groups in the second period, right? Not only because of the special team situations, but you want to preserve as many legs as possible, not only theirs, but of your top group as well for that third period, knowing that's when you're going to be the most fatigued is by the end of the game. And so you really want to leverage them in those situations. Like I said, time on ice, in my opinion, should be highest for your third and fourth group in the second period in particular. And then I put another disclaimer on the bottom here. I think this happens all the time. And I can admit, I'm humble enough to say, I'm not always at my best as a coach. When I'm making calls, maybe I'm not as focused, I'm not as dialed in as I should be. But I think it's really important that if we are going to ask our team to build an identity around the second period and be the best that they are all game for those 20 minutes, we need to be too. So as coaches, we need to make sure that we're accountable to this as well. And in the second period, that should be like our ultimate moment as we go in and we step onto those benches, that we're dialed in, we're paying attention, because it's critical that we do too. The second kind of main bucket I wanted to talk about is how we think about that long change effect. Second period is the physical component of it, right? So we've talked a little bit about the mental, psychological aspects of it, but there's inevitably this physical component as well. So again, I bucketed into 3 different areas. The first would be just kind of that physical conditioning, right? That's going to have to be non-negotiable. The second is finite skill development and how that shows up. And then the third is practice and systems preparation. So when I think of these 3 areas, I put on here conditioning is number 1, and I put it's just good old-fashioned skating. Like, I'm not going to bore you guys with ideas of skating drills necessarily because we're all sitting in these round tables, and I was looking around the room today, I'm like, there are thousands and thousands of years of experience from a lot of really gifted coaches in this room. I would not be giving you anything profound by telling you how to run a skating drill. I think we all within our tables can share on that if you're looking for ideas in that way. But inevitably, in the second period, call a spade, there will be moments that we are stuck in our D zone. So to make sure that our conditioning is in a really good space is going to be important. But like I said, I'm not going to bore you with a bunch of details on what that looks like for your group. I would say one thing about this, and I'll give you guys a drill idea and kind of show you how we implemented it at St. Thomas this year. But I would encourage what I'm going to call front-end conditioning. And that just means providing some type of skating on the front end of the drill strategically so that you can actually create one of your groups to be tired to simulate a game-like scenario of the second period. So again, we'll talk about that a little bit more. If you can add in a change component as well, then that's going to be your cherry on top. So finite skills. This is kind of that second main area of the physical aspect of this. For me, finite skills, when I think about the second period, on the defensive side, the biggest thing my brain goes to is zone exit skills, right? Because again, we're going to get hemmed in. It's inevitably going to happen. So are we prepared from a skill standpoint when we do? So to me, on the defensive side of the puck, it's how do we get pucks out? So I think of zone exit skills like we call it high confrontation, which is when our winger goes to the wall, they meet their D that's coming down who's trying to hold the zone, right? So the skill set of getting in front of that defenseman, making sure to actually get to that lane first and retrieve that puck in a way that they can either get a chip or a clear or go directly center, hit the weak side wing. It can look a lot of different ways. But again, that is a small skill set within the game of when we're looking for kind of those ugly zone exits and we inevitably just need to find a way to get it out. What does that look like for your defense? What does it look like for your forwards? Defenders in particular, it's a very simple skill, but something that you should be building into as many drills as possible throughout your season is going high and hard off the glass is what we call it, right? So again, you're coming around, I see a thumbs up, we've got a fan of the high and hard off the glass, but just a simple zone exit where we find some plexiglass, hit it, and make sure that we get that zone clear. On the offensive side of the puck, I think, okay, so there's actually an opportunity here as well. I'm talking a lot about the defensive side, but obviously offensively, we can capitalize and score goals like that article talked about. So how do we sustain offensive zone time when the long change effect is actually happening. To me, there's a couple that come to mind. And again, similar to what Heather was saying, this is not an inclusive list. It's just a couple ideas to get you thinking. But to me, one of the most important skill sets is strategically, we call it depositing the puck. I'm sure a lot of people use that terminology, but rather than just dumping the puck, we deposit it. We want to get something back, right? Kind of a return on your investment. And so how do you offensively deposit the puck well on a zone entry or as you're approaching the red line to give yourself an opportunity to sustain that offensive zone pressure? I also think of just those individual skills. If you want to keep the zone or hold the zone a lot longer, then offensively we have to use things like puck protection and make sure that we're creating kind of those possession opportunities, whether that's through passes or, like I said, puck protection. So the offensive side has quite a few things. The defensive side has quite a few things. Again, this is by no means an exhaustive list, just things to get you guys thinking about how do finite skills look in your practice structure? How are you building into drills? How are you working with players individually in small groups to make sure that you are giving them the skill sets to be successful during the second period? And then the third area that I talked a little bit about is practice and systems preparation, okay? And again, I put on here, this has to look particular for your group because I think everyone is markedly different in this way. But to me, systems is kind of this big idea in hockey, and it has to be tailored to your group of players. So for me, I think this year, as we looked at this long change effect, the second period, we started to try to tweak our practice environment to really kind of celebrate different things. I mentioned celebrating small skills earlier. So to me, how do you create, let's say, practice structure where you're celebrating things like offensive zone possession? Maybe it's the longer you have the puck, the more reward there is, right? Or it could be something like in drills, you're designing them in a way that actually celebrate 2 assist type of goals, knowing that at that NHL level, that's how the mass majority of goals are scored. So be creative in your thinking to say, how can we design practice plans? And we have about 2 hours worth of great content from the first speakers of how you can be intentional in this space. I think of things that are as small as having an F3. That's really, really disciplined. This was something we harped on our players about, is they're up high in the zone, they're anticipating turnovers and being really strategic. Because as that defensive team is trying to exit, especially when they're tired, that's going to be an opportunity to get a lot more turnovers against a team that's maybe fatigued, kind of taking more liberties with their passing, their skating opportunities, and getting some turnovers to go the other way. The last, again, just another example here I put on was line changes, right? So you need to get buy-in from your players in this way. But again, really thinking of a systematic level of how are we going to change? How are we going to coach this to our players? What are we going to talk about? What are we going to emphasize? For us, something that we talk a lot about is changing with 3 players when we can from our defensive zone. So if you get kind of a simple, ugly, whatever it looks like, zone exit, trying to change with 3 players that are on the weak side of the ice. And then we try to have our strong side winger, usually winger, sometimes a centerman, but more often a winger. And then our strong side defenseman, they actually come up through the neutral zone and they try to push and steer, ideally towards the benches where we're getting fresh legs, right? So again, it's just kind of those systematic tweaks and things to be thinking about when you're coaching your own group and how that looks. So I did promise you guys a drill idea. I do have a few different drill ideas that we kind of creatively came up with this year to try to simulate some of this. I'm just going to show you one today, but would be happy to connect with anyone after the presentation to talk a little bit more about what this can look like. But this was the one that we came up with. So we would actually have our defensive group. They would start on the goal line down here. And then we had an offensive group, and they started on the blue line up here with a puck. Again, we're trying to really look to create this game-like scenario of you have a team that's tired and a team that's pretty fresh to really kind of give that experience. So on the whistle, this is the D skating pattern, or the defensive group, I should say. So the forwards D, all 5 of them are lined up on the goal line. When the whistle blows, their skating pattern is to skate out to the blue line, they stop at the blue line, and then they just skate back and forth between the blue line and the goal line. For defensemen, we have them work on their mobility and their footwork, so they get up to the blue line, they stop, pivot, and then they're skating backwards. But again, you're kind of controlling this as a coach, but the whole goal of it is to make sure that, number one, they're not just standing and comfortable as a team is entering the zone against them, but also to really kind of create that fatigue feel in the defensive zone. So we always kind of let them go for maybe upwards of 40 seconds if we want them to be really tired, but could be anywhere from 20 seconds to 40, but you're trying to create that game-like scenario. So they're skating back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And this is what I was referring to when I called it front-end conditioning. You're intentionally trying to make a group tired to create that long change effect feel. On the second whistle of the drill, the offensive team takes off from the blue line. They carry a puck, and now they're working on some of those offensive skills I described, where they're going to actually deposit the puck in a space that they're going to be able to try to get it back and create a 50-50 opportunity based on that deposit. So then they go in. We talk a lot with our defensive team as on the way back, they're trying to get into their positions, but as they do, they use shielding. The term that we use for shielding is just meaning you're trying to get in front of that offensive team as they're coming into the zone. So I'm trying to use my body and my spacing on the ice to make it a lot harder where they have to go around me. So again, another kind of skill set on that entry. And then we actually put 45 seconds up on the clock. You guys can do it just in your own head if you want, or make it more organized like we do. But then they play for 45 seconds in the zone. The two different goals is defensively, all you have to do is get a zone exit, right? Because you're already tired, you're trying to play good defense. If you get a good zone exit that does not lead to an icing, then the drill is done. Everyone gets to go sit on the bench and take a break. If in that 45 seconds, the offensive team actually sustains the zone the whole time, they're creating offense, they don't allow for that zone exit opportunity, they've just won that 5-on-5 battle. You blow the whistle at the end of the 45 seconds, and then the defensive team, unfortunately, they get down and they do 5 push-ups. So again, now you're kind of back-ending the conditioning on top of that full long drill set. So again, just really trying to recreate systems in practice. It's really hard, obviously, because it's an imperfect science, but thinking creatively about how are we designing drill ideas that can set up like game-like scenarios. So again, when we talk about the long change effect, I'm going to go back to kind of the beginning here. Statistically speaking, if you do want to give your team the best chance to be successful and to win a hockey game, if you have a simple and a significant second period, then you're doing exactly that, right? So if there's a period to put that emphasis on, it actually is right in the middle of the game. And like I said, it's really important to design this strategy within your own group. It can't be exactly what I'm telling you. It can't be exactly what someone else at the table might do. It's descriptive in this presentation, but it's not prescriptive. Think creatively about what it's going to look like. The things I touched on that I do think are important, just a quick revisit, is that mental and psychological component of it. Engagement, working on flow states. I really encourage you guys to write down flow, that psychological construct. I think it's really important for our athletes. Team identity and how you build that, and really make sure that you can leverage that against an opponent that's probably not doing it. And then that bench management from the coach level. And then again, the physical, we just touched on these things, but train for the second period, be conditioned, be properly prepared in that way, work on finite skills that help with those zone exits, and maybe work on those entries and offensive zone pressure and possession, and then making sure that we're designing practice drills to simulate those game-like scenarios as well. And if you take away nothing else from the presentation, no details, my only hope is that you take away that there's a very impactful effect of the long change effect. Thank you.
How's the second period for the University of St. Thomas?
You know, we're working on it. It could be better, but I would say that we progressed quite a bit this year. Yeah.
Okay. My guess is that a lot of people think, and a lot of coaches are going to go home and start talking with their co-coaches about just these issues with the second period. Are we a good second period team or not? Because I agree, most players, most coaches, we're a first period team or a third period team. So I think you've really given these people a lot to think about.
Yeah, I hope so. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.